The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I welcome our witnesses and our members. I apologize for the delay. This hearing, critical as it is, has been beset by the pandemic, by votes, and by weather. And of course, as a consequence, we are part in person, part remote, and that's going to lead to a little bit of awkwardness, but I'm just delighted that we are underway for this conversation. As a reminder, members participating in the hearing remotely should try to be visible on camera throughout the hearing. And as with in-person meetings, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted unless recognized by the chair so we can avoid all the crosstalk, and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. I would recommend to all of our members and witnesses that they write in block letters, unmute at the top of their prepared statements, just to keep things moving along well. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. And as a reminder, we are well spaced out in this room, but per the guidance of the attending physician, members and staff and all others physically present should wear a mask except when they are speaking. Without that, I will wish everybody a good afternoon, good morning, I guess, and thank you all for joining this hybrid hearing. This hearing is entitled Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy, How Improving Economic Opportunity Benefits All. Before we proceed to opening statements, I ask for unanimous consent that members who are not on the committee be authorized to provide brief remarks when recognized by the chair. So ordered. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today, our committee joins one of our most important and most difficult national conversations. Our committee, in its work on economic disparity, will grapple with the fact that communities of color are, in the aggregate, behind white communities on pretty much every indicator of economic health and prosperity. The median white family in America has about $184,000 in family wealth. The median black family, $23,000, or just over 10% of what the white family has. Unemployment peaked during the COVID pandemic at 14% for white workers. It was 19% for Hispanic workers. I could go on citing just about every single parameter of prosperity and well-being. But the mission of this committee is to offer solutions to help point the way to an America in which the color of your skin is not such a powerful predictor of your prosperity. So we will look at the historical antecedents, some of which precede this nation's existence by 150 years, but things like the legacy of Jim Crow, of laws which explicitly denied citizenship to blacks and Asians, redlining, land confiscation, and the racism which we have never fully stamped out of our nation, echo today in the numbers I cited above. There's another American story, of course, one of progress. The civil rights movement and the legislation of the last generation, the integration of our armed forces, the opening of our universities, professions, and public spaces to communities of color, all the progress driven by people like Martin Luther King points the way. But we must not confuse better with finished. We've got a long way to go. So we will look at the progress in the hunt for solutions, and not just solutions that stem from the power of the federal government, but for all solutions that work. We sometimes talk about a whole of government effort. The problems we address today are whole of society, and so the solutions lie, as they always have, partly with the government, but also in our neighborhoods, our businesses, our families, our houses of worship, those many things that supported me so well, but which continue to support in deeply, deeply unequal measure a white child born in my community of Westport compared to a Hispanic child born in Norwalk, Connecticut, or a black child born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'd now like to yield the remainder of my time, 3 minutes, to a man whose 8 decades in our country encompass everything that we will talk about today. Jim Clyburn was born into a deeply segregated South. He now helps lead the Congress and the country that he loves and understands better than most. Mr. Clyburn, who is joining us remotely, I now yield 3 minutes to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here with you today, and to the ranking member, Steele, members of the committee. Thank all of you for having me as a part of this hearing today. As many of you know, I'm a bit of a student and lover of history. And I take seriously George Santayana's admonition that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. With his words in mind, I would like to take place today, this year, and place it in sort of a historical context. The 20th century was a time of great economic growth, but also a time of significant inequities and widespread racial discrimination. While every American was impacted by the Great Depression, Black Americans were especially devastated. By 1932, half of Black Americans were out of work, and racial violence and discrimination were on the rise. Many Black Americans were initially energized by the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. He courted Black voters, had Black visitors to the White House, and had Black advisors. Unfortunately, while the New Deal was credited with having ended the Great Depression, it was not a good deal for Black Americans. Racial discrimination, employment marginalized Black Americans at a very critical juncture, preventing them from an equitable economic recovery. Roosevelt's implementation of Social Security was significant. It lifted millions of senior citizens out of poverty, but it did not cover farm and domestic workers, where over 65% of Blacks were employed. At the end of World War II, millions of American veterans came home and re-entered civilian life. President Roosevelt had signed into law the GI Bill, which promised educational benefits, job opportunities, and housing assistance for these returning veterans. It returned over $7 in benefits for every $1 it cost the American taxpayer, and ushered in decades of prosperity in post-war America. Again, this enormously successful economic program discriminated against Black Americans. For example, the Veterans Administration adopted the Federal Housing Administration's discriminatory redlining policies, shutting out Black Americans from the full benefits of the GI Bill. By the end of the summer of 1947, only 2, not 2%, only 2 of the 3,000 GI Bill home loans were issued to Black veterans. The New Deal and GI Bill are just 2 examples of how successful and widely celebrated economic programs left out and marginalized Black communities, exacerbating the wealth gap we have today. That's why Congressman Seth Moulton and I introduced the GI Bill Restoration Act. Our bill seeks to provide the descendants of Black World War II veterans some of the GI benefits their families should have enjoyed. This would be one step towards righting the wrong and addressing the wealth gap. I often invoke Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. Together, we can and we must heed de Tocqueville's words. Through this committee's work, we must work to dismantle barriers that have prevented Black Americans from achieving the American dream, and to identify public policy and business practices to encourage and assist every American to reach their economic potential. Thank you very much for having me today. And now you're back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clyburn. We appreciate your participation, and I now recognize the ranking member for the same 5 minutes enjoyed by the majority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling today's hearing. I think it's well titled, Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy, How Improving Economic Opportunity Benefits All. And I look forward to a thoughtful and robust conversation today about how we can help all Americans. I believe what we'll hear today is that what's best economically for all is best economically for communities of color. The opposite is also true. What's worse economically for all is worse for communities of color. Before we talk about today's challenges, let's take a look back at where we were before the pandemic. In 2019, real median wages grew at a rate of 6.8% for all Americans. How did communities of color fare under the policies of the Trump administration? Real median wage income grew at 7.1% for Hispanics and 7.9% for Blacks, higher than the national average. Evidence that what's best economically for all is best economically for communities of color. The job environment was so strong, it pulled workers into the labor force and off the sidelines. We were closing the labor force participation gap between Black and white workers. Also in 2019, child poverty across races and ethnicities hit its lowest levels ever. In 2019, it fell by 1.3% overall. The poverty rate for Blacks dropped by 2%, Hispanics by 1.8%, and Asians by 2.8%. Again, evidence that what is best economically for all Americans is best for communities of color. 2 years ago, we got punched in the face by coronavirus, and the federal government put in place dramatic new government programs. Today, we're here on the first anniversary of one-party control, and many households are struggling. And what's disappointing to see is that what's worse for all Americans is also worse for communities of color. The most recent report showed inflation rose 6.9% over the past year. It's clobbering fixed-income seniors and low-income workers and disproportionately impacting communities of color. What's worse for all Americans is worse for communities of color. In the past year, following a period of anti-police rhetoric, we saw violent crime moving in the wrong directions. For example, many cities hit new record highs for murders. In Chicago, 797 individuals were murdered. Since 2019, murders were up in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, LA, San Diego, Seattle, Portland, San Antonio, Atlanta, Boston, Indianapolis, and many more cities. Black and Hispanics are disproportionately victims of these violent crimes, yet in absolute terms, whites exceed that of communities of color. My priority is for everyone to have the ability to feel safe in their community, everyone. And I hope we discuss that point today. What's worse for all Americans is worse often for communities of color. I hope our discussion today explores the impact of defunding the police policies have had on communities of color. Let's shift gears and talk about schools. During the pandemic, we saw school districts close down in-person learning, and now we're dealing with the compounding consequences of learning loss. What's worse for all is often worse for communities of color. It's why I strongly support school choice, and it's great we're having this hearing in preparation for next week's National School Choice Week. Given that the state of some of our public schools, especially after what we've seen in the past few years, and even in the last few weeks in Chicago, parents need greater control over their child's education. The research of Dr. Raj Chetty describes the need for high opportunity areas to improve economic outcomes. School choice is educational opportunity. I've highlighted some of the things that worked well in a robust economy. I've highlighted some of the things that currently are not working. But Mr. Chairman, before I close, I do believe there's areas where this committee can truly work together. And let me offer an optimistic statistic. The data supports what we already know. The entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in America, and particularly among women of color. In the US, 17% of Black women are in the process of starting a new business, compared to 10% for white women or 15% for white men. Entrepreneurship offers flexibility and generates wealth. And I challenge this committee to come together to help even more women of color further succeed by doing things such as reducing red tape, addressing occupational licensing, leveraging the tax code, and encouraging mentoring. Let me conclude. What's best economically for all Americans is best economically for communities of color. I look forward to a robust conversation of how we can help all Americans restore our way of life and rebuild our economy. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. And before we turn to our witnesses, I ask for unanimous consent to play a brief video. As has become the custom of the committee, we like to feature the voices of folks that aren't eminent witnesses or ourselves. So I think this runs about 2 minutes, and with unanimous consent, let's run that video, please.
My rank is Sergeant First Class E7 Johnny W. Cheatham. I didn't get the chance of getting a GI Bill. I wish I had it. I've been in this world for 92 years, and I was in the Army 25 years. I was in Vietnam 11 months. I was in Korea 16 months. I was in Germany 6 years. I didn't receive the same benefits as the rest of the GIs because they got the GI Bill and got a house and, with a low interest rate. Financially, it was a bad deal for me. I was on my way to Vietnam, and I had 5 kids and a wife. And if I got killed over there, I wanted them to have a place to stay. The FHA said, "You're a soldier. We cannot sell you that house because soldiers move around too much." I think they steered me away from getting a GI loan. I felt discriminated against. I don't think it was right because it was a higher loan. The blacks, they don't have a chance to get ahead like us, like the white. I was denied going back to school to get my bachelor's degree. Told them I had a social science degree. And he said, "You cannot come to UMKC with that lower degree. You had to have a social art degree." And that's what I did. They knew I was trying to get a bachelor's degree. And when I went to go get my bachelor's degree, they told me you used up all your benefits. That was it. That was discrimination right there. It was a lot of, prejudice and everything, but we still survived.
This recruiter kind of engaged me and started asking me, had I thought about joining the military? And, he caught me at a time when I was, feeling pretty low. I mean, I was at my lowest. I was homeless at the time. I had already quit high school and I was working to support myself. I went to the military intelligence unit in the National Guard, asking them, one, I got a spot. 2, I said, "Would you all support me to go to officer candidate school?" And they said, "We'll support you, but we don't have a role for you when you finish." They had already picked who their person was going to be. They were going to support for school for military intelligence. So I ended up not going military intelligence, and that was fine because I really was trying to figure out between military intelligence and ordnance, and I ended up choosing ordnance. But here's the kicker. They didn't choose me. They chose a white female. Okay, that's fine. I was the distinguished graduate. I took all the top leadership awards, and then they asked me, "Well, would you still like to join our unit?" And I go, "Nope, I'm already gone to ordnance school." The challenge that we have, whether it is looking at race, gender, ethnicity, right, is that to ensure that the policies and procedures and regulations that we put together don't have a second and third order effect that was unintended.
Thank you again. Now we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Dr. Valerie Wilson, Director of the Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy at the Economic Policy Institute. Next, we'll have Dr. Derek Hamilton, Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and Founding Director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Power, and the Political Economy at the New School. Next, we will have Ms. Janet Murguia, President and Chief Executive Officer at Unidos US. And after that, we will have Dr. Jamie Riley, Director of Race and Justice at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And last but not least, we will have Mr. Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. For those joining remotely, the timer will appear as a participant on your screen. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer, and when the red light appears, quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of other witnesses and the committee members. I will gently remind those of you who are coming in remotely of the time if necessary, with increasingly urgent reminders if for some reason you can't see your own clock. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Wilson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Steele, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm going to discuss racial and ethnic disparities in unemployment and earnings that undermine the economic well-being of communities of color and, by extension, the U.S. economy as a whole. I will also discuss what is known about the factors contributing to those disparities and tools for addressing discrimination in the labor market. Labor income accounts for about 73% of total household income among the bottom 80% of non-elderly households in the United States. Yet large and persistent disparities in unemployment and earnings by race, ethnicity, and gender are defining features of the U.S. labor market. In the interest of time, my remarks will center the experiences of Black and Hispanic workers, but I also want to acknowledge that Native American and Asian American and Pacific Islander workers also face discrimination and disparate labor market outcomes. The roughly 2-to-1 ratio between the Black and white unemployment rates has been clearly documented in national statistics for almost 70 years. This disparity has held across multiple periods of economic expansion and recession, and is observed for all age cohorts at every level of education and for men and women alike. Over the last 4.5 decades, only the most highly educated and most experienced Black workers have approached anything near unemployment rate parity with their white counterparts, and only during periods of exceptionally low unemployment. These statistics are consistent with multiple field experiments revealing that Black job applicants with equivalent and sometimes superior credentials to white applicants are less likely to receive job callbacks. Since the 1980s, unemployment rates for Hispanic workers have also consistently been higher than those of non-Hispanic white workers. Even at the lowest levels of unemployment in 2019, in each education category, Hispanic workers had higher levels of unemployment than similarly educated white workers. Racial and ethnic pay gaps persist even after accounting for factors commonly associated with individual productivity, and have in fact gotten worse over the last 40 years. In fact, less than half of the observed Black-white difference in average hourly wage is explained by differences in education, experience, or geography, some of the main factors presumed to determine pay. One of the most troubling aspects of growing Black, white, and Hispanic white wage gaps is the fact that they have grown most among college-educated workers, those presumed to have done all the right things, yet still receive lower returns on their investment in higher education than their white counterparts. All these things point to structural factors such as discrimination that go beyond an individual's ability to close unemployment or wage gaps by simply acquiring additional skills or education. While education and skills can contribute to better individual outcomes, absent intentional efforts to level the playing field, education and skills do not necessarily create equal outcomes. For example, the most notable period of narrowing of the Black-white wage gap occurred from the late 1960s through the 1970s and can be traced to the passage of important civil rights legislation and active enforcement of anti-discrimination and affirmative action policy. The fact that labor market discrimination has persisted well beyond the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Pay Act cannot be overlooked. In the time I have remaining, I'd like to focus on some ways to improve accountability for discrimination by addressing the unequal balance of power and information between employers and employees. This includes policies that encourage employer transparency and prohibit the use of salary history in setting current salary, funding of federal, state, and local enforcement agencies at levels consistent with caseloads, and protection for all workers against practices that coerce employees to waive their rights to legally challenge unfair or unequal treatment. The role economic disparities play in eroding bargaining power among workers of color is often underappreciated. Higher rates of unemployment and lower levels of income and wealth raise the stakes associated with holding out for a better job or challenging unfair and unsafe working conditions at the risk of employer retaliation. Strengthening workers' rights to organize give them a stronger collective voice to advocate for better pay and benefits, training and promotional opportunities, and protections against discrimination and harassment. Finally, it is important that we bolster our data infrastructure such that instances of disparate treatment can be better monitored, documented, and addressed across all affected communities. In closing, while this hearing is focused on the collective economic cost of racial and ethnic disparities, there is also a collective moral cost that may not be easily quantified in terms of dollars, but greatly diminishes the value of the American ideals of freedom, justice, and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hamilton, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and other members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. I'm gonna speak rather briskly but clearly about inclusive economic rights to build a moral economy. Over the last 50 years, essentially all of our nation's productivity gains have gone to the elite and upper middle class while effectively flatlining real worker wages for everyone else. This has resulted in an obscene, undemocratic, dysfunctional concentration of wealth and power, especially by race, that has not been seen since the Gilded Age preceding the Great Depression. At issue and relevant for this body is government's complicity in facilitating and generating extreme economic and racial inequality. Many Americans, Black and brown and indigenous families in particular, have low wealth, low income, inadequate health care, and work in precarious but essential jobs. An Economic Policy Institute report entitled The Productivity Pay Gap traces the relationship between economic growth and worker compensation since the mid-20th century and finds that between 1948 and 1979, the post-war period characterized by dramatic economic growth, productivity rose by about 100%, while at the same time, real worker compensation rose by a comparable 93%. In contrast, from 1979 to about today, a neoliberal period emphasized by trickle-down supply-side economics, productivity rose by about 70% and worker compensation rose by only about 12%. During the New Deal and Great Society post-war period of high economic growth, middle-class lifestyles became more accessible, and with a more than doubling of American productivity, clearly firms benefited too. What is critical to note is that it was never the case that a middle class simply emerged in America. Rather, it was government policy that provided the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. These policies provided successful examples of federal government investing in heavily in the greatest growth in the American middle class. However, because of the Faustian bargain highlighted by Representative Claiborne, in order to maintain racial hierarchy and convince many legislators to come on board, it was no accident by both design and implementation, Black people were largely excluded from the wealth generating and labor protections of this era. In this current era, stigmatization based on race is strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks have become symbolism for undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators by which we define a surplus population. And where there are clear indictments for low-income white people into this as well. They are characterized as persistently unemployed and unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, whose subsistent need is deemed a drain on our fiscal budgets. This is the fuel and rationale for austerity policies. If behavioral modification, particularly with regards to personal and human capital investments, if that's the central issue, why should we fund government agencies and programs which at best misallocate resources to irresponsible individuals, and at worst create dependencies that further fuel irresponsible behaviors. This is wrong because the presumptions pay little attention to the roles of power and endowment or capital. Wealthier families have financial advantages and buy crucial additional advantages for themselves and their children. Lack of wealth prevents many families from accessing these advantages, contributing to the ever-increasing distance between those born with and without resources. The trust funds should not be the exclusive domain of the wealthy. Baby bonds can be an effective policy to establish an economic birthright to capital and pathways to build wealth for all our nation's children. The neoliberal framing of our economy naturalizes poverty and inequality by castigating it as the result of unproductive and deficient behavior. An inclusive economic rights frame turns this on its head by locating poverty and inequality where it belongs, the absence of resources. That is, poverty and inequality are the result of policy choices that deny people the resources they need for meaningful lives. Public intervention is needed to guarantee economic rights in order to counterbalance the trends in capital to consolidate and exclude and mitigate unjust, accrued economic and racialized power from a sordid past. Government needs to ensure universal and quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, access to capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm. So I'm going to conclude to be in the interest of time. Let me just say that far more than revenue collection and privileging existing wealth, the federal government could use its most powerful fiscal tool, the U.S. tax code, to guarantee income and promote economic security for all families. The refundable tax credit is a good start, but we can do better than cutting poverty in half. No one should live in poverty. It's immoral and it's cruel. We need to get measure right. Growth has become the explicit measure of economic well-being. In isolation, it fails to capture the many dimensions of prosperity, human capabilities, morality, sustainability, and civic engagement. In conclusion, government has a fiduciary responsibility to invest in its most treasured resource, its people. We need to commit to racial and economic justice.
Dr. Hamilton, your time has expired.
It's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. Ms. Murguia, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I'm Janet Murguia, President and CEO of Unidos US, formerly known as the National Council of La Raza. We're the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the US. For more than 50 years, we have advanced opportunities for the Latino community. We also partner with nearly 300 affiliates, community-based organizations that ensure Latinos and Latinas have more equitable access to our nation's safety net and opportunities. They adapted quickly during the pandemic to respond to human needs by providing emergency food, PPE, access to broadband, and housing support. Affiliates are also culturally competent, trusted intermediaries that remove access barriers by mobilizing Latinos and Latinas to get vaccinated, to keep our economy open, enrolling them in health coverage, and providing housing counseling to prevent eviction and foreclosure. The Select Committee has a critical charge to create a more inclusive and dynamic economy. Even today, the work of Latinos is fueling the country's economic recovery. The Latino community has had a higher than average labor force participation, start businesses at more than double the overall rate, and wields significant purchasing power. Latinas specifically are one of the fastest growing segments of business owners in the United States. Yet, too many structural factors impede our community's fuller contributions. Latinos and especially Latinas also work disproportionately in jobs with very low wages. Even when employed full-time, most Latinos fail to receive the benefits of work. More than half Latinos, including 55% of Latino men and 51% of Latina women, are unable to earn a single paid sick day through their jobs. Latinos are also disproportionately excluded from supports due to immigration status and misinformation on eligibility, among other reasons. Such persistent economic disparities hurt the community and our overall economy. Last year, we found that a Latina-headed family has a median net worth of less than a nickel to the dollar of a typical family headed by a white man, and just a tenth of the net worth of the typical family headed by a white woman. Latinos have incredible resilience and fortitude. But I urge you to imagine the contributions they could make to the economy if our community had a fair and equal opportunity to thrive and participate. The moment has never been more critical. Latinos are more likely to die from COVID, less likely to have health insurance, and more likely to struggle to make ends meet. Importantly, the systems that exacerbate inequality and keep Latinos from building wealth can be addressed. As Nelson Mandela said, overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice, and in our case, it's an act in our own economic interests. We offer 3 critical recommendations. First, Congress must pass the Build Back Better Act. Among other reasons, all children deserve a permanent, fully refundable credit that restores eligibility for those with a tax identification number and provides monthly payments. The 2021 revisions of the CTC give this policy the potential to cut Latino poverty by more than a third. From our affiliates in Florida, like Hispanic Unity, to folks near here in Casa de Maryland in the DC area, our network continues to engage with Latino families to help them receive the transformative investments of the child tax credit. Second, home ownership is the single most powerful strategy for closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. Congress should provide a down payment assistance and improve the availability of affordable, safe housing. And to enable savings that allow home ownership and financial well-being, Congress should make college education more equitable by investing in completion grants and canceling student loan debt. Third, Congress should provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. We are currently facing an epic shortage of workers, which is hurting our economy. As Bloomberg Business reported last October, nationwide, there's more than 1 job opening for every American who wants to work. Immigrants have long been a part of the solution to labor shortages, yet last year, the U.S. saw the lowest levels of international migration in decades. At the same time, an estimated 5.2 million undocumented immigrants are essential workers who allowed us to put food on our tables and care for our sick and vulnerable. Just as we leaned on immigrants to help us weather the pandemic, they are key to our future economic prosperity. We hope these proposals will receive serious consideration, and I look forward to today's discussions on the ways to support the Latino community's inclusion in the nation's economic life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Murguia. Dr. Riley, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Himes and members of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. My name is Jamie Riley, and in my role as a National Director for Race and Justice for the NAACP, I support both our economic inclusion and criminal justice reform work. I bring you greetings as well from our President and CEO, Derek Johnson. Throughout our 113-year history, the NAACP has prioritized and advocated for solutions to the issues addressed by the Select Committee. As the oldest and largest civil rights organization in the country, our work is rooted in addressing racial injustice and inequity. We are steadfast in our commitment to advancing economic equity and reducing an ever-widening racial wealth gap. This ensuing economic disparities faced by Black Americans have been exacerbated by the pandemic. But let me be clear, while the pandemic has exacerbated longstanding economic problems, it did not create these inequities. COVID-19 has shed a spotlight on them, and in doing so, we now have the opportunity and responsibility to permanently eradicate these issues. The NAACP and its 2,200 local branches and state conferences have been steadily working to combat economic inequities and provide economic opportunities. Given my time, let me share a few high-level examples of our local and state efforts. The Stockton, California branch of the NAACP is currently collaborating with the city to expand access and opportunities for minority-owned businesses by conducting a brownfield study leading to a cleanup initiative, which will result in new revenue-generating spaces for minority-owned businesses. The work being done by the Stockton branch will also create new employment opportunities within the community. The city itself has earmarked $3.4 million to support this effort. And through this program, newly established business owners will have access to business development incentives, funds, and technical assistance from nonprofit and private industry partners. In Houston, Texas, our NAACP branch established the Homes for Houston Housing Program in 2017. Later in 2021, they partnered with Freddie Mac to advance the program. The Homes for Houston Housing Program is designed to increase minority home ownership, preserve and retain existing minority communities, and drive investment for sustainability. Through the partnership with Freddie Mac, the program expanded to address wealth building and social equity in previously redlined areas, historic communities of color, and majority minority populations. Further, in partnership with the nation's third largest home builder, Pulte Homes, the Homes for Houston program was selected to pilot new housing product from Pulte Syntex Home Builders. This revolutionary program is designed to provide home ownership opportunities for buyers at 80% of the area median income. Launched in the summer of 2021, the first 2 new home owners closed in December. Monique Dixon, a single mother of a young son, summed up the impact for all participants in the program after closing when she said, "This program has truly changed my life." We all agree that access to a good paying job with benefits is central to achieving economic mobility. In Connecticut, the 1 Million Jobs campaign established by the NAACP Connecticut State Conference is dedicated to strengthening equity in the economic status of formerly incarcerated community members. The Connecticut initiative is building sustainable relationships with local and national employers who are committed to offering job placement opportunities. The 1 Million Jobs campaign has partnered with various industries, including healthcare, manufacturing, and retail, to set aside 10,000 jobs over the next 3 to 5 years for formerly incarcerated individuals across the state. The NAACP understands the importance of coupling strong local economic inclusion efforts with public policy that provides the additional social safety nets families and communities need to thrive. For example, the expansion of the child tax credit for the first time reached the lowest income families. These monthly payments were an essential lifeline and helped to address historic economic inequities by lifting over half of Black children out of poverty. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, in the state of Florida, 700,000 children under 18 are at risk of slipping back below the poverty line or deeper into poverty if the CTC is not made permanent. Making permanent the expanded child tax credit can have profound intergenerational benefits and address historic racial economic inequities. In closing, our collective impact is more powerful and enduring than one of us alone. We know that when diverse people come together to solve problems, the result is more innovative, more inclusive, and yields more productive solutions. To address these systemic issues of inequities, as displayed in the examples above, it will require stronger public-private partnerships between governmental agencies and lawmakers, nonprofit and community-based organizations, and private corporations, all of which must be committed to create and sustain an inclusive economy. We believe that a truly diverse and inclusive economy benefits all Americans and is the thread that binds our economic goals. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to present testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. Mr. Rowe, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and the distinguished members of the House Select Committee, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Sir, you might need to pull the mic just a little closer to you there.
Okay.
Let's
Thank you for having
reset
me.
the clock, please.
Okay.
Mr. Rowe.
I submit my testimony today as a proud product of the New York City public school system, kindergarten through 12th grade, a graduate of Brooklyn Tech High School, Cornell University College of Engineering, and Harvard Business School. I'm the founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network of character-based international baccalaureate high schools with the first campus to open in the Bronx in 2022. For the last 10 years, I was CEO of a nonprofit network of public charter elementary schools and elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We educated more than 2,000 students, particularly low-income Black and Hispanic kids, and we had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list. Many of our parents understand that racial disparities exist, but they know those disparities do not have to be destiny for their kids. These parents were given the power to choose our schools because they wanted their children to develop the skills and habits to become agents of their own uplift and to build a better life. Yet in District 8 of in the South Bronx, of the nearly 2,000 public school students beginning high school in the South Bronx in 2015, only 2% graduated ready for college 4 years later. That means 98% of students either started 9th grade and dropped out of high school before completing their senior year, or they did earn their high school diploma, but still needed math and remediation if they were to go to college. We cannot ignore the fact that the racial disparities that we're seeking to close originated long before they show up for adults as statistical gaps in financial wealth, home ownership, or crime. In this district, if only 2% of mostly Black and brown kids are graduating from high school, capable of doing even basic reading and math, why would we reasonably expect from high school, why would we reasonably expect these same kids as adults to be leading flourishing lives in higher education, workplace, starting businesses, getting married, having children within marriage, or any of the other behaviors that typically mark passage into young adulthood and entry into middle class or beyond? I see young people today trapped between two dominant narratives. The first is what I'll call blame the system, the belief that America is an oppressive nation, that every institution is steeped in racism, that there's a white supremacist lurking on every corner, that capitalism is evil, that these systems are so rigged and discriminatory that the individual is powerless, and only a massive government intervention is the solution. The second narrative I call blame the victim, the idea that America is full of opportunity and that if you're not successful, then it must be your fault. You have some pathology that is the cause of your failure. You should have pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. Both of these narratives are wrong and rob young people of agency, the sense that they can control their own destiny. If we really want to help young people of all races achieve the American dream, I propose a new framework based on encouraging young people to embrace 4 pillars, what I call FREE, F-R-E-E, family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. A revitalization of the 4 local mediating institutions that drive human flourishing. Family is helping young people understand the importance of forming strong families. This could include teaching decision-making in schools, that if you finish your education, just a high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And then if you have children, marriage first. The data shows that 97% of the time, you avoid poverty. That's information young people should know about family. R is religion, encouraging young people to develop a personal faith commitment. E is for education. A bedrock of that is school choice, and ensuring that every parent has the right to choose the education that best meets their child's needs. And the final E is entrepreneurship. How do we help young people understand the ways to access capital and build wealth? To see how these 3 pillars of family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship interact, consider that according to the Federal Reserve's 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances, and the data has been cited by several of my co-witnesses, the wealth gap between Black and white Americans at the median in 2019 was $164,000. For some, this gap is vibrant proof of a permanent and insurmountable legacy of racial discrimination. Yet if you look at the same exact data, the same 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances, and just consider 2 other factors, education and family structure, the median net worth of a Black two-parent, college-educated Black household is nearly $220,000, about $160,000 more than that of a typical white single-parent household. While race matters, there are other factors that matter more. We have a moral imperative to encourage young people of all races to adopt a new cultural norm around family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. I look forward to discussing this in more detail.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rowe. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to, first of all, say thank you to our witnesses. There's unanimity here that we obviously have dramatic, racially correlated disparities. And so this is a really important topic for this committee, and I hope that the bulk of this hearing will be spent on all of the suggestions that all of the witnesses made for how we can address that. Let me start with Ms. Murguia. I was struck that you said the single most important thing we could do was to increase home ownership. Let's stipulate that. We will, by the way, do a hearing on home ownership and housing, but I've got a lot of questions in a little time, so let me just give you 60 seconds to talk about it. I read your testimony, but what are the most effective things that we, as the government, could do to encourage home ownership around, I see you identified down payment assistance in particular, but let me give you 60 seconds to expand on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. Yes, when it comes to addressing the wealth gap that Congressman Clyburn so eloquently reminded us of that exists in Black and Latino communities, we find that having access to home ownership is so critically important. And for us, the best tools are investments in home ownership counseling. At Unidos US, we have the largest network of home ownership counselors engaging the Latino community in the country. And what we have found is having culturally competent trainers who are knowledgeable, have the trust of the community, and are able to effectively connect them as trusted partners because of the language and competency, they can put them on a track to actually getting financially literate and achieving the savings and credit corrections that they may need to make. So for us, investments in home ownership counseling services is really key, but also reviewing access to credit and making sure that we're looking at the underlying barriers that are there when it looks to the traditional, when we look to the traditional methods of how individuals can have access to credit. We need to look at how we're looking at the traditional way we put together credit scores. And there are other factors that could be used. And when we have used them in certain communities, they prove to be very credible and allow us to engage these individuals who might otherwise be shut out of the system. So engaging in community-based organizations who are trained and increasing funding for counseling and homeownership counseling is one of the most important ways we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Murguia. We're going to take this up in a hearing on housing. I'd like to move to Dr. Wilson. Dr. Wilson, in your written testimony, you say policies geared toward maximizing employment and limiting the depth and duration of recessions are essential to making workers less vulnerable. I'm particularly interested in that. I've been in a robust conversation with Ms. Jayapal about how we can do better when faced with crises like the housing crisis of 2009 and, of course, the COVID pandemic. So let me give you 60 seconds or so to just elaborate. Obviously, we put in place a wide array of aid programs, $6 trillion worth roughly in the last 2 years, I should say. Give me just a brief summary of where and how we could do better. What would be most effective?
Well, the reason why that is an important thing to do is because we know that communities of color disproportionately suffer more in periods of recession and are often the last communities to recover, both in terms of jobs as well as income. So one of the things that is critically important to do is to, early on, begin to fill in those gaps in income that will inevitably come when people lose their jobs. We also know from the investments that were made over the last couple of years and the most recent numbers that came out on income and poverty is that income and poverty rates did not take nearly the hit they would have without those interventions, and in particularly among communities of color. So investments in job creation that goes to communities that have historically higher rates of unemployment and poverty will be especially important. Income supports are important. The expansion of the unemployment insurance program that we saw during the pandemic was incredibly important and effective, again, at helping to support incomes. And the child tax credit expansions were also things that we've seen as being effective at limiting the harm done by the economic downturn.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. Mr. Rowe, last question for you. I listened closely to your testimony, and speaking for myself, and just based on my own experience and the experience of pretty much everyone I know, prosperity and success in this country is a combination of individual initiative, hard work, discipline on the part of the individual, combined with the support of families, of communities, of public schools like the ones that you and I got to attend. And we spend an awful lot of time in the polarized culture we are sort of trying to figure out which is more important, which is less important. But to me, that's a little bit of a silly place to spend time, because it's very, very clear that the support structures, whether we're talking about families, communities, or public schools, or programs like Mr. Clyburn talked about, have not been there for communities of color. And we're going to, of course, do our best to address that. But I want to just ask my question to you. When I hear that we need cultural change, I'm inclined to agree with that, but I don't know how one brings it about. And I suspect that it's not the federal government or state or municipal governments that do that. So I'm always worried when we talk about churches needing to do better, families needing to do better. I think there's absolutely something there. But what are the tools that we have as a community and society to improve those critical elements of the support structure?
It's a great question. One of the reasons I focus on this new framework, FREE, is that I'm highlighting those 4 mediating institutions: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship, which are so crucial because those are the character-forming institutions that so many young people right now are not gaining access to and need to be able to be successful. So I shared some data which said if you finish your high school degree, get a full-time job, marriage first and children, 97% of the time you'll avoid poverty. We have to remove the barriers that make it difficult for young people to get on that pathway. So for example, if you're in the heart of the South Bronx right now, there's a cap on the number of charter schools that can be created. If you had the great idea to build a great school in that district where 98% of kids are not being successful, we need great schools as one of the institutions that can give kids that belief that they can be successful. We talk about housing ownership. If you're graduating without the ability to effectively read and do math, you're not gonna be able to figure out a mortgage statement. So a lot of the issues that we are talking about way down the road, those problems, those challenges originate early, and we have to revitalize those mediating institutions that you and I benefited from to ensure that young people even have a shot.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. I'm well over time, so I'm going to have to cut that short and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I can start with you, Ms. Mejia. We've seen school closures across the United States, and the data shows that there's been significant learning loss, in particular those that don't have access to in-person learning. In your research and analysis, have school decisions to close across the country disproportionately impacted Hispanic children?
Without a doubt, it's been a great concern to us. We understand more than any other community how having a lack of access to broadband, having essential workers in multi-generation households, these kids, their inability to have that access to a classroom is really harmful. And we've seen the emotional related, and our data has supported that for the Latino kids. We remain committed to what's in the best interest of
only because I got to be tight. I appreciate it because I think it's a really important topic, and I'd love to explore it more. But I want to jump over, if I can, in my limited time, to Mr. Rowe. Mr. Rowe, you spent a lot of time studying the gaps that exist in communities of color. What do you believe is the biggest misconception in today's conversation?
Sorry. Well, a lot of times we talk about disproportionate impact, which is very important to look at. But it's very important that we're constantly highlighting percentage differences by group. And what that tends to do, it masks the raw numbers. So for example, in education, we often talk about the racial achievement gap in educational outcomes in reading because there's a higher percent of Black students that are not reading at proficiency relative to the percentage of white students that are reading at proficiency. And so there seems like there's this gap. But according to the 2019, for example, National Assessment of Educational Progress, there were about 3.75 million white students at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade cumulatively that were not reading at NAEP proficiency levels. There are about 1.4 million Black kids not reading at 4th grade, 8th grade, 12th grade. But the fact is that the number of white kids not reading at reading proficiency dwarfs the number of Black kids, and yet you tend to pathologize around this issue is only resident with kids of color or Black kids. And so that tends to pathologize this idea that the problem's only over here, but if you start to dissect the problem, you see that the reason that there are 3.75 million white kids not reading at grade level have to do with things like lack of school choice, unstable family structures, not effective reading instruction, those solutions that are across race. And that's the other problem that I think is often a misperception, that all of these issues the causality is race-based. And so if you assume that almost everything has race-based causality, then you almost always tend to come up with race-based solutions, as opposed to universal interventions that could help kids of all races.
What do you think then the biggest causality is in your research and analysis?
I mean, it's complex. There's no silver bullet. But certainly, if more kids were born and raised in married, stable, two-parent households, that's the kind of foundation that evidence shows. I think all progressives and conservatives alike would agree that outcomes for kids are far better when kids are raised in stable, married, two-parent households, which is why the first element of my free framework encourages educating young people about the rewards and consequences in their own lives. Then I think having access to great schools through school choice usually is another big anchor. And then this idea of entrepreneurship, understanding how to grow wealth. How do I access capital? In the new high school that we're launching, every ninth grade student through the Charles Schwab stock split program is going to have fractional ownership of 10 S&P 500 companies. So they'll have ownership of Apple, Walmart, Google. So instead of just using an iPod or an iPhone, they can be an owner of the company and understand what that means and understand how to translate what that could mean in their own life and what this idea of entrepreneurship could be for them.
So let's dive into education, if I can, just briefly with you. It's an area you have a lot of expertise in. You talked about the importance of school choice. Next week is School Choice Week. How does that impact different demographic groups across the country?
Well, unfortunately, school choice exists throughout our country for people who are middle or upper class who have the ability to move to a great suburb and access public schools, or people in urban communities who can pay to go to a great private school or religious school. But for the people who need it most, kids in low-income communities, which are often disproportionately kids of color, although again, they're far more white, impoverished kids in our country. So this is a universal challenge. And so the lack of access to high-quality schools is one of the fundamental elements that impedes the ability for a kid of any race to get on that first rung of success.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rowe. I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. Cognizant of my time, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the ranking member. We turn now to member questions. Just a reminder to members, keep an eye on the clock. I will happily accept finished answers beyond the 5-minute mark, but we'll be less happy about new questions after the 5-minute mark. We are operating under seniority modified by the present at the gavel rule, and under that, I now recognize Ms. Jayapal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and thank you to this excellent panel of witnesses as well. Mr. Chairman, I've been thinking about our conversation and through the course of this hearing that perhaps the way we need to think about this inequality in both income and wealth as it relates to race and ethnicity is to divide it into 3 categories. First, the question of building wealth. And many of you, the witnesses and Mr. Clyburn, talked about building wealth. I think of home ownership in that context. Mr. Hamilton, you raised baby bonds. I think about that in that context. The second is around ensuring savings, because this is a really critical piece of both living and contributing to wealth. And so that's around things like jobs, and how do we make sure that workers of color are earning the wages and the benefits and seeing all of that in their income, but also it's about the social safety net and how we support families of color in particular. And then the third is around stopping destruction. And this is a topic that the chairman and I have had many conversations about during a crisis. Mr. Clyburn talked about the Great Depression. I would say that COVID and everything that has happened with unemployment, as workers of color are the first to get fired and the last to get hired, that if we were to keep workers in their jobs and be able to provide them with income, and Mr. Hamilton, you and I have worked on a proposal around this, the Paycheck Recovery Act, that would have protected. And so I just want to throw that framework out as I ask my questions, but also emphasize that they are very interconnected. So Mr. Hamilton, let me start with you and go to this question of how the racial wealth gap limits economic opportunity and reinforces income inequality for people of color. And in addition to the baby bonds, which you mentioned, what are the other strategies that would help us on both the building wealth category and
the ensuring savings category. And I have a number of questions, so if you can just keep your comments as short as possible, that would be great.
And I'll start with the latter part, which is the most critical ingredient is capital by which to begin. All the astuteness, all the knowledge, all the effort is irrelevant if you don't start with a piece of capital. Financial literacy becomes irrelevant if you don't have capital to manage in the first place. So whether it's access to home ownership or baby bonds, capital is key. And be careful with home ownership, because this fits to the second part of your point, ensuring savings. If you don't have political protections from predation, then you leave people vulnerable to what we had was the Great Recession. So both are critical. You need capital, you need things that you mentioned, quality jobs, quality income, but you also need the regulatory environment that limits the predation, particularly on something as vulnerable as somebody's racial identity. So those would be my answers.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Wilson, Dr. Wilson, I want to talk about how public policy can ameliorate the negative impact on wages of people of color. And specifically, I point to the occupational segregation that exists, the sorting of workers into jobs based on race and gender due to policy, stereotypes, and discrimination. So for example, Black women make up less than 10% of the labor force, but about 1/5 of home care aides. And if you think about what Mr. Clyburn said on domestic workers, this is another area where we see so many women of color in particular holding these jobs that simply were cut out of basic civil rights protections. Ms. Murguia talked about undocumented workers. Many of those are in these low sector jobs, low wage jobs because of their undocumented status. So can you comment on specific public policies that we need to think about in ameliorating the negative impact on wages of people of color?
Sure. One of the main challenges and issues with occupational segregation is that it is connected to what the value that we place on certain jobs. So in occupations that are female dominated, or occupations that in particular women of color occupy a disproportionate share of those jobs, we find that they tend to be lower paying, offer fewer benefits, and fewer other sorts of protections. One of the things that's important to that is really giving workers the right to organize and helping to balance power between employers and employees in that situation.
Very important. I see my time has almost expired, so I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, that I think a bill like the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights is really important here, and I look forward to exploring the stop destruction part of this, which I know you have scheduled. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal. Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Bice, I think your mic is off, or it's not close enough. Let's reset the clock. And
how's that? It said live mic, so I didn't know. My apologies. Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Stile, and for the witnesses for being with us this morning. Mr. Rowe, in your testimony, you discussed what I consider to be an important bedrock for our nation, and that is faith and family, which includes stable marriages. You noted 97% of those who are married are able to avoid poverty. The Catholic Church also notes that marriage is the greatest social educator of children, as it instills some of the most basic civic virtues into our children, which are passed on for generations. And I learned about this several years ago when a professor from George Mason visited Oklahoma and talked about the fact that a two-parent household is actually a better indicator of outcomes of a child than educational attainment was. We know that children raised in families with two parents are more likely to attend college, as you mentioned, likely to be more physically and emotionally healthy, and are less likely to use drugs or get involved in criminal activity. Unfortunately, last year, only 65% of American children live in households with two parents, married, present. This issue is often overlooked, but I think it has a tremendous impact on our nation's children and their opportunities and well-being for the future. Mr. Rowe, can you discuss how the growing gap in marriage rates has impacted American society?
Thank you for the question. One of the things I think that's so important as we think about disparities and the negative elements, we also should study success. How is it that people who are historically oppressed have been successful? So in 2017, there was a Millennial Success Sequence report that found that a stunning 91% of Black people that avoided poverty when they reached their prime young adult years, age 28 to 34, if they followed what's called the success sequence. They earned a high school degree, worked full-time, and married before having any children. The data is just overwhelming. And when you're talking about what is the impact of these disparate rates of marriage, it's what I call an equal opportunity tsunami. In 2019, the non-marital birth rate for women 24 and under, for anyone in that year, it was 71%, 7 out of 10 of all women 24 and under, 91% within the Black community, and 61% in the white community. And again, because there are far more white women in that category, there are far more white children, the high likelihood, there are always exceptions, and I work with amazing single moms in my own schools, but the high likelihood of negative outcomes for both the parent and those kids is overwhelming. It's again one of the reasons I focus on what do we do to help young people understand the rewards and consequences associated with different series of life decisions as they enter young adulthood. So understanding that if you finish your high school degree at least, get a full-time job of any kind, marriage, then children, your chance of being in poverty is virtually nil. It's not a guarantee. And it's not a prescription, it's a description, because we're not dictating to a young person what they should do with their life, but young people deserve to know. And if more young people, who, by the way, aspire to be married, but so what we need to do is remove the barriers that make it difficult for young people to get on each one of those rungs. And as we've cited multiple times, getting a high-quality education is the first part of that rung. And one last point on the same study of successful, and another study focused on successful Black men, having a faith commitment was one of the additional elements within their lives that said that they had the power to control their own destinies.
And to follow up on that, what do you think the marriage disincentives are in federal policy?
Well, it is true. There are a range of policies where lower income families with children often face a financial penalty if they get married versus staying versus cohabitating. And so it's one of these sort of government phenomena where you create perverse incentives for people to actually avoid the most stable structure that could be good for their own lives as well as their own children. So I think that hopefully that's a kind of bipartisan common sense that we should just take a look at. We shouldn't have policies that deter people that might be in love, that want to be together, that have a child, and yet they feel they're going to lose government benefits, and that's so overwhelming that they choose not to get married. That just doesn't make any sense.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bice. Ms. Jacobs is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first just want to note that recent research by Raj Chetty shows that, which is on Black boys, shows that Black boys raised in two-parent households still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds. So I'm not sure we should pretend that people's personal circumstances are really where the solution to this entirely lie. Mr. Hamilton, I'd like to ask you about some of the solutions that you proposed in your testimony. I'd like to start with baby bonds. I think they're a really important proposal to level the playing field, and I was hoping you could quantify how you would expect baby bonds to impact median wealth for young adults. I know many scholars, including Naomi Zodi, have examined this and would love for you to talk a little bit about what the real impact is that we'll see for that on young adults.
Thank you for the question and the reference to Naomi Zudi and her point that demonstrates that in about a generation, for those that actually receive a baby bonds, it projects that the racial wealth gap would be closed by nearly 80%. And let's be clear, it's being closed at the median for those actual individuals that received the bond. But the point is just that if we look through American history, the ways in which we have fueled an American middle class when it comes to asset is that governments provided the capital for them so that when they were a young adult, they were able to get into the economic security in a passive way of an asset that appreciates over their lifetime. You know, the difference between a renter and an owner is a down payment. The difference between an entrepreneur and a worker is often some capital to start a business. The difference between someone with a 401k plan versus one without is often a college degree without debt that puts them in a job where they can get the automatic benefit of an employer offering them resources so that they can grow in a retirement account.
Thank you. And in your testimony, you also talked about the fact that no one should live in poverty, and that while it's great that the expanded child tax credit cut poverty in half, we know that's not enough. So I was hoping you could talk about what policies you would put forward on top of that to end child poverty. And then also in your testimony, you discussed guaranteed income. At this moment, we know there are guaranteed income pilots across the country for families who need it most, including in San Diego, where I'm very proud to represent. So I was hoping in this answer, you could also talk about some of the lessons we've learned from those guaranteed income pilots and some of the outcomes and how that might inform some of the work we're doing on this committee.
Again, thank you. And you know, one key point is that poverty really is a political choice. We choose to allow poverty to exist. In other words, we have the mechanisms to literally eliminate it. And I'm glad you referenced the guaranteed income pilots, because oftentimes you get a rhetoric that offering people income will disincentivize them to engage in productive economic activity. What we found was actually the opposite with those guaranteed income pilots. By seeding people some cash, they were able to engage in more work, engage in better work. And that is indeed the point. The point is that the role of government isn't to manage people, isn't to manage their culture. The role of government is to facilitate people to be their best selves. And in an inclusive economic rights platform with things like using the earned income tax credit as a mechanism to offer resources to people directly, getting rid of that work requirement, that is a political choice. To offer people resources so that they can be their best selves is indeed the point. All the ingenuity in the world, all the hard work in the world leaves people vulnerable to those that have resources to be exploited and extracted from unless they have some power by which they engage in transaction. And that is the point.
Well, thank you very much. And in my last 45 seconds, Dr. Wilson, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what the costs of the racial wealth gap are to the broader economy and what some of the economic and social benefits would be to narrowing this gap for everybody.
Well, I'll speak a bit about the impact in particular in the labor market. I referenced the fact that the existence of wealth disparities has an impact on people's ability to, as Dr. Hamilton just mentioned, extend their job search so that there's a better job match where they have a better employment opportunities. It limits their ability to opt out of working for someone else and starting their own business because they don't have that capital. It also serves as a source of cushion in the event that they lose a job or become ill and have to be out of the workforce. So it's very important, again, for stabilizing people economically.
Thank you, and I know my time's up. So, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Mr. Davidson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony, and to my colleagues. It's an honor to serve on this committee and to focus on these important topics. You know, Dr. Hamilton, perhaps more than any of the other witnesses, you highlighted the importance of government. And in general, you know, the parties divide politically over whether we need more government or less government, or more redistribution or less redistribution. And that's kind of independent of race or ethnicity or gender or anything else. It's an ideological issue in general. But a lot of times people focus on the redistribution as the solution to the problem. And what I want to contend is that often it's causing the problem. It's exacerbating the problem because as my colleague, Mr. Stile, highlighted, as the economy does well, everyone does well, and as the economy does poorly, frankly, the most disadvantaged are the most harmed. And there are disadvantaged people in our society across all societies, including across all races. And Mr. Rowe, you highlighted, quantitatively that there are more poor whites than there are poor blacks. I want to highlight the role of money, because that's very clearly a function of government in our current economy. And when you look at how money is being used, since 1971, the United States went from sound money, which was pegged to an objective standard, and sought an advantage for America's economy by creating inflation. We didn't want to be constrained as we confronted the financial burden of funding the Great Society programs launched in the 1960s with the ability to collect taxes. And so they wanted to just create more money. America wasn't the first government to do this. This has been done through all of time since man created money. One person with power sought to use the power over money to their own advantage. Instead of creating a neutral store of value and a neutral means of exchange, they wanted to use the financial system to increase their power. So the United States did that, and what has happened over that time? The inequality in America has actually grown. Now, socially and culturally, we've seen lots of benefits in terms of healing wounds due to the role of government finally doing what was not done at our founding and what was not done during Reconstruction. And we had great progress in the civil rights era in the 60s. But shortly after that, we destroyed our money. And so when we see these policies that spend more and more and more and more, it grows the monetary base, undermining the value of your hard-earned dollars, and then the assets are inflated. And frankly, it's a fair point that by race, historically, whites had an advantage over all other racial groups in America. And so the asset prices have grown. The value of your home has grown. That benefits everyone that owns a home, but it benefits the people that own the most expensive homes more than it benefits the people that own the less expensive homes. People have pensions, and historically, white people in America have had better pensions than minorities. So it grows their pensions faster than it grows the pensions of others. So even as we fix some of these things, the destruction of our money is driving us further and further apart. The trouble is that when you only offer more government and more spending, and you don't pay for the spending, not only do you bankrupt our country, you bankrupt our culture. And so I think we need to embrace sound money. And the only way to do that is to spend less money. We gave up on the idea of collecting the taxes. Frankly, both parties talk about tax reform, and Democrats, to be fair, talk about collecting more taxes more than Republicans talk about collecting more taxes. But no one offers a solution to actually pay for all the spending that we're doing. And that is going to be a painful remedy. So, Mr. Rowe, you highlighted better than anybody the social structures, the things that government can't do. But my colleague, Ms. Bice, highlighted that there are some impacts of governments. Do benefit cliffs, as you alluded to, part of them structural due to policies that affect marriage, do they disproportionately affect the four principles that you highlighted so effectively?
Yes, and let me just quickly note, I'm sorry that she left, but Member Jacobs mentioned the very important study, the Raj Chetty study, and it is an important one. There's an article in the New York Times, I think it's entitled, "The Punishing Impact of Racism on Young Black Boys," and you read this article, and it just feels on every instance, black boys are just falling in from economic class downward. What's interesting is that for black girls, there was no difference in terms of white girl performance, but amongst black boys, it was a very important asterisk. When a father was in the home, or there was a strong presence of fathers in the neighborhood, you had huge indicators of upward mobility. So it's really important that we look at all of the factors, the governmental factors and the very intimate factors, starting with family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. Those are the social structures that that I think will give our kids the kind of lift that I think we all are seeking to achieve for them to succeed.
Thank you. I wish we had more time. Appreciate the opportunity. My time expired and I yield. Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Ms. Capter is recognized if she is in the room or in the ether. Ms. Capter, are you with us? I guess not. We'll come back to Ms. Capter. I will recognize Ms. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their for the time and energy research that they have really put into it. Thank all my colleagues for being here. I had to step away for a conflict, but I certainly think that this is one of the most important sort of roundtables that we have had. I do think when I really appreciate all the witnesses, and I really appreciate some discussion that gets us toward closing these disparities and equities, as opposed to just throwing stuff out there. I think, for example, the discussion of school choice and entrepreneurship as examples are worthy of discussion as to whether or not they close some of these disparity gaps. But I find it sort of disturbing, sort of to buy into the notion that somehow helping people who are in poverty, single moms who, for example, that somehow giving them the child tax credit creates the kind of inflation and disincentive and welfare queenness that lowers our growth and contributes to the disparity, and somehow that the welfare benefits that we give them trap them into poverty. And I guess maybe I'll start with Dr. Hamilton. I am noting here a footnote from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco in April of 2021, the economic gains from equity. And what they have said is that notably, parental marital status, education, and wealth have negligible power in explaining the Black-white income gap at all levels of income, nor does geography play an equalizing role, even when controlling for parents' income. Black boys have lower adult incomes than their white counterparts in 99% of census tracts. And so we have all these explanations. And so I just guess I want you to comment on that within the time that I have.
Apologies, you nailed it right there. If you look at wealth as an outcome, no matter what you look at with regards to cleavage, the disparities don't disseminate, they actually increase. So over time, what you find is, if you look at even just Black women that are married and you can pick that with a college degree, as they age in the life cycle, their wealth is lower than that of comparably aged white women who have never been married and who are not college educated. And to me, that is part of the point that we misunderstand. These disparities don't disseminate with educational marriage. They actually increase in multiple domains, and especially when we look at wealth. And if I may respond to a couple of things, the notion of redistribution, well, we need to understand history. The Homestead Act redistributed native lands to primarily white men, and it facilitated growth. So what we're talking about is government interventions that are not immoral, but actually learning from those lessons and doing it in a more equitable, generous way and not an immoral way. And the story about inflation, what also took, first off, the US came off the gold standard well before 1971. Indeed, we were able to finance World War II in large part by not being on the gold standard. So deficits aren't new. What is important is how we invest in our greatest resource, our people. In 1971, we had the OPEC crisis. If we look at other countries that have inflationary problems, it is usually because of a foreign national exerting power over them. So our currency crisis is driven largely by the manipulation of oil prices that had detrimental effects on our whole economy, which is another reason why we need the Green New Deal. And then finally, looking at marriage, the presumption that Black people don't want to be married, is a problem. You know, marriage itself is an outcome. Maybe if we incarcerated Black men on less often, maybe if we facilitated people to be their best selves, we would offer the access to love to all people. Love itself is something that's innate and human, and we should facilitate it, not use it as a scapegoat for why people are not thriving.
And thank you so much for that. And I just want to say before I go, I get very emotional, Mr. Chairman, when I hear these straw man arguments made every time we try to talk about disparities, and you get these boogeymen things, like these government programs and welfare queens and defund the police and so on. None of that is really helpful toward moving this conversation forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Let me just confirm, Ms. Kamek is not with us online, correct? Okay, in that case, we recognize Ms. Capter for 5 minutes. Oh, okay. Ms. Kamek is recognized for 5 minutes, followed by Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Steele. I appreciate it. This hearing today is extraordinarily important, and as someone who was raised by a single mom, grew up in a lower income family, and has experienced homelessness, this is something that I think we should be addressing today, talking about how our nation is founded on the principle of equal opportunity, not equal outcome. And so I'm very intrigued by some of the commentary here today. And again, thank you to all our witnesses for appearing before the committee. I think this is a very important conversation. So as we all know, right now we're in the midst of an economic crisis with record inflation that hurts all Americans, but especially lower income families. Now, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the annual inflation rate in 21 hit a 39-year high of 7%. Inflation is, in fact, a tax on every single American, but it is also, in fact, regressive and hurts individuals and families who are on a tighter budget and cannot afford to spend more on goods and services. In my own district, I have seen regularly at the gas pump how that number has gone up and up and up, and the cost of goods has gone up and up and up, and it's especially tight for those on a fixed income. Now, according to a Bank of America report from November that separated inflationary impacts by demographics, those most affected by inflation were, quote, rural households without college graduates, African Americans, Hispanics, and Latinos. Now, I represent a very rural district, so I can attest to the fact that inflation is very real and hurts across the board. Now, inflation has increased every single month since this administration was sworn in, and I'll repeat that because I think it bears repeating. Inflation has increased every single month since this administration was sworn in. President Biden's economic crisis has cost the average American family 2 paychecks and the average family over $3,500 just this last year. 8 out of 11 months since his first full month in office, real wages have decreased under his leadership. Now, what is this president's plan for the economic crisis? More spending. In fact, trillions more in spending. By giving more money to the government, we, the American people, keep less in our pockets. This doesn't grow on a tree. It's pretty simple. The more the government spends, the less we, the American people, get to keep. It's clear the administration's plans are not working. In fact, as I was walking to my office, I saw a CNN poll that stated that 60% of Americans think that this country is on the wrong track. The American people clearly see that. Just look at the recent job approval polls, and they understand what is best economically for all Americans is best economically for communities of color. Now, before COVID-19, under President Trump's economic policies, we experienced record success for all communities. I think we can dive into the statistics of, nearly 7 million people were lifted off of food stamps. Unemployment for women hit its lowest rate in nearly 70 years. Income inequality fell for 2 straight years in a row, and the largest amount in over a decade. The bottom 50% of American households saw a 40% increase in net worth. Wages rose fastest for low income and blue collar workers, a 16% pay increase. The list goes on and on. So, Mr. Rowe, I know that we're limited on time. But in your testimony, you discussed the concept of success sequence, with one of the first input in the equation being a high school degree. I have concerns that with approximately $162 billion in unspent COVID relief funds for schools to safely reopen, schools across the country are still closing. Do you believe that there will be any long-term effects on students who aren't able to attend in-person learning, and how specifically that impacts communities of color?
I believe you asked, is there a long-term impact of what's been happening over the last 2 years to our kids? Absolutely. The level of school closures, the ineffectiveness of remote learning has really just resulted in significant learning loss, which frankly, none of us really know the impact. What's been interesting, though, is if you look at those schools that did remain open over the course of the last 2 years, you had Catholic schools that did incredible jobs of keeping schools open, in person, masked, and safe. There were some charter schools, some district schools, but the vast majority did not. But imagine if you were a parent, that your school was just having remote learning with worksheets and no real-time engagement of teachers, and there was a Catholic school down the street or a charter school down the street that was staying open, that had vibrant instruction, and you didn't have the ability to send your child there. How is that fair? That's what we mean by school choice and the ability for young kids to have a shot. We gotta give them a shot to get on that first rung. And in terms of what we tell young people, you'll never hear our teachers telling our kids, they've gotta wait on the people in this room to pass trillion-dollar redistribution programs in order for them to be successful. What are the factors in their control? And that's why it's important that they understand the series of decisions that give them the greatest rewards, and they understand the consequences if they choose differently. But they gotta realize that 97% of the time, if you finish your high school degree, full-time job, and if you have kids, marriage first, the data says poverty can be avoided. It's not a guarantee, but that's important information young people need to know.
Well, thank you, Mr. Rowe. I know my time has expired. Chairman, without objection, if I may submit a question for the record to have all of the witness answer.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentlelady's time has expired, and Ms. Capter is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for putting an excellent hearing together that is focused largely with excellent witnesses on macroeconomic trends across our country. I want to focus on microeconomic solutions, and therefore my 2 sets of questions will relate to these. I will ask the questions and then we'll welcome your replies. First of all, Dr. Hamilton and Ms. Murguia, you both have referenced different aspects of our economy.
Really?
I'm interested.
Good.
I'm sorry, the gentlelady will spend. Ms. Kamek, please mute your mic, and let's give Ms. Capter back the 10 seconds.
Perfect. Yeah, because it's so good. I wanted somebody.
Ms. Kamek, if I could just ask you to mute your. Thank you. We will give Ms. Capter back the full amount of time spent there. Thank you, Ms. Capter, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I'm going to propose a couple solutions and see how you react. If we look at our country, we have a shortage of farmers. Let's look at the agricultural sector because Dr. Hamilton mentioned the Wagner Act. And Ms. Murguia talked about pathway to citizenship. We are importing more food now in our country. It's actually shocking, the amount we produce versus the amount we import. So we have a shortage of farmers, and in my region, half of the arable land is now absentee-owned, and it's because farmers are retiring and there aren't enough people going in that business. If we look at who's actually working the land, many people come from Latin America, and they work extremely hard. What if we were to invent a program where we would take vacant land and we would provide very reasonable financing, if financing at all, but there could be earned citizenship through working in the agricultural sector above board, not having to go through this horror that people face on this continent? Would it be possible to create a program where we would tie hardworking people to available farmland with reasonable financing? Just think about that. And then the second question is, On the issue of educational attainment, Mr. Rose, Dr. Rose, I was very impressed with some of your comments. In my district, if I go to a place where the attainment by the professionals is low, according to the scores that the state keeps, I have learned something through a GAO study we commissioned. And we found if I go to a given school, in September, there are 400 students. And we take their names, and in May, when we return, there are 400 students. But there are 400 different students. Because the transiency in these communities is so high because there's no permanent housing. We've talked about housing this morning, generally speaking. And we have many single parents now and grandparents raising grandchildren because of the opioid crisis, mainly. So in talking to the experts, we've been talking about either building housing in those communities so there could be stability, or creating residential schools where individuals would, with the consent of the custodial adult, the child could go to the school during the week, they'd have regular meals, they would have an organization to their day, and on weekends, they would go back home, or whoever the custodial adult in their life is. How do we begin to move these attainment rates up in communities where the transiency is, you can identify it, it's intergenerational, and it is completely destructive. By the third grade, we lose them. You can see it. You can see it in the reading scores. It isn't, but adults don't seem to be able to, in either situation here, for large numbers, millions actually, of individuals who work in the agricultural sector, to give them fair worth for their work. And in the educational sector, we are losing millions of children across this country every decade. You can just see it. And it doesn't change because we don't change the structure. I heard what you said about Catholic schools. I don't think that's enough. I think we need a fundamental way of looking at the transiency at the microeconomic level in these neighborhoods that have been so hard hit. I'd be interested in any reaction to those two separate issues, please.
I guess I'll go and try to be really.
Well,
Yes.
go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think you.
Let's go start with Ms. Murguia, and then we'll go to Dr. Hamilton.
I'll just briefly say, Congresswoman Capter, and I appreciate all your leadership over many years, but thoughtfully, I think we'd be very open to exploring what opportunities we have for so many farm worker families, for so many who have been connected to the land and been essential as revealed by the pandemic, but many of them have been here for more than a generation. It's imperative for us when we have these labor shortages to make sure that we're being smart, not just doing the right thing, but being smart about how we can bolster our economies, especially in rural areas. And these are high contributors. And one of the things that we've just reinforced over and over again is just making sure for children in particular who are part of those families that we expand that child tax credit. There are at least 1 million undocumented kids who should be eligible with the relevant I-10 information. We ought to be able to do that and make sure those families at least have that security of the basics around children. But we'd be open to looking at the program that you've talked about. It sounds very sound.
I would love it apart from this committee. I think we have an opportunity to do something remarkable, particularly in my part of the country. We're not California, that's a whole different ball of wax out there. But for our region, I think local farmers would even help sponsor them.
We have community-based organizations in Ohio, in your district, that have done a lot of work with the farm worker community, but El Centro de Servicios Sociales, Adelante, which is the Latino Resource Center, I know they can be critical partners as we look at this in your region in particular.
Thank you, and I want to talk to you about community development credit unions as well, but I don't have time. But we will submit a question to the record on that.
I will, if Ms. Capter would like, I'm happy to give Dr. Hamilton a few seconds to also respond to the question if you'd like.
Okay, we have worked very hard because of the credit issues attendant to Spanish-speaking individuals who live and work in our area. And we have found a great hesitancy on the part of Spanish-speaking individuals to even come into community development credit unions where there are language capabilities and people who will help them. There is an endemic resistance to trusting any financial institution. Can you give us insight on that? Because I want to build this one in my community called Nueva Esperanza. It has such capacity and what it could do in the future, but there's this hesitancy. How do we work with the Spanish-speaking community?
Well, the playbook is
Ms. Murgia, I'm sorry. I am going to give you a few seconds to respond, but we're more than 2 minutes over, so short response, and then if you could submit the answer for the record.
Sure, the playbook is there. Community-based organizations can get the supports, the investments we've made through ARP, but also with the Build Back Better would add additional supports for those community-based organizations that have language and cultural competencies to engage on those access to housing and credit issues.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rowe, I wonder if he could comment on the education.
The gentlelady's time is very much expired, but you're more than welcome to submit a question to the record if you'd like. With that, let me just confirm Ms. Ocasio-Cortez is not with us online. Are there any other members who are with us online that I have not recognized? Appearing not. I'd really like to thank our witnesses, both those in person and those online, for participating in what I think is America's hardest conversation, but in some ways America's most important conversation. All too often held poorly and sometimes exploited for a variety of reasons. The fact is this country, of which we are all so proud, is burdened with the original sin of slavery and burdened with the ongoing tragedy that very few immigrant communities, as much as we define ourselves as a community of immigrants, are welcomed in the moment of their maximum immigration. So I really very much appreciate all of you and the members of this committee who had this conversation in a constructive and productive way. There will undoubtedly be some follow-up, but I'd like to thank you again for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. The hearing is adjourned.